My Govanid, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I'm going to talk about how Peter Jackson takes violence and uses it to basically spoil the drama of a particular scene, that scene being the arrival of Gandalf and the Three Hunters at the Golden Hall of Meduseld and the healing, shall we say, of King Theoden. Now, that's not to say that Peter Jackson's version of this scene does not have its own drama. It does, but even that, to the extent that it has its own drama, it's kind of cheapened by the action that goes on in the scene. And it's a very different scene in a number of different ways, and we're going to get into that. But the main focus here is when Gandalf heals Theoden in the movie, we really don't get much of a sense of what really goes on other than, ooh, magic happened. In the book, it's a lot more subtle, and therefore it's a lot more interesting in its own ways, but also there's just not a lot else going on, and we can really focus in on it. And the battle is one of words, it's not one of one wizard versus another. And so the events that occur in the respective versions of this scene make for a very, very different type of storytelling. So let's take a look at the differences and see what we make of that. So the first thing to point out here, of course, is that in the movie, Peter Jackson adds this element of a group of thugs that Grima Wormtonge has hired? We don't exactly know. But there's a group of people that Grima Wormtongue has helping him basically lay down the law against anybody who tries to assert a little bit of independence over or any influence over Theoden other than him. And this is how he gets rid of Éomer. This is, how he tries to get rid of Gandalf and Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, which of course doesn't work in the end because apparently Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli barely have to try to beat up literally anybody. Which, that is part of the cheapness of this scene, is the fact that they handle this group of thugs with remarkable ease, despite the fact that they're outnumbered. I'm guessing 2-1. It's kind of hard to tell exactly how many of these guys there are, but there's certainly several of them. And there's only 3, for Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. Gandalf is not participating in the hand-to-hand combat. This, of course, is not at all in the book. There's no thugs. It's just Grima Wormtongue, and he is using his subtler influence of demoralization and lies and other forms of verbal influence over Theoden to get Theoden to do what he wants, or rather what Saruman wants, rather than having, anybody there to kind of be the muscle and carry out what he needs him to do. So it's a very different kind of scene in that sense, just from that alone. What is more interesting, however, besides just this, is the fact that, like I said, in the book, there is much more of a battle of words. In the movie, when Gandalf comes to the point of actually trying to heal Theoden, there's a lot of not much lead up, actually, in terms of the verbal confrontation between Grima and Gandalf. And in fact, in the book, a lot of the verbal confrontation is not even necessarily between Wormtongue and Gandalf. Theoden is the one who speaks first, and he speaks at some length. So just to, give you an idea, in the movie, when they come in, the first thing Gandalf says is, "The courtesy of your hall is somewhat lessened of late." In the book, this line comes much later, after Grima has basically insulted all 4 of them by saying that they're clad in gray, which is really beggar-like, and they're, look like beggars at the door. And Gandalf points out, "The courtesy of your hall is somewhat lessened of late. Did your herald not tell you who these people are? They've laid weapons at your gate that are worth many a mortal man, even the mightiest." That comes much later. In the movie, Gandalf leads with this line, presumably referring to the fact that Hama made him almost give up his staff. Not quite give it up because, you know, he talked him into it, just like he does in the book. But, you know, it's presumably this that Gandalf is referring to, and when he says this line, Theoden says, "Why should I welcome you, Gandalf Stormcrow?" Looking at Grima as if, did I say the right thing? And then Grima takes over from there. There's really no other verbal interaction with Theoden. In the book, Theoden actually says a lot of the things that Grima ends up saying in the movie. He talks about how, you know, you're a herald of woe, you come with bad news all the time. You know, this is really kind of annoying, Gandalf, how you find the most inopportune times to visit. And then Grima takes up that theme and runs with it. Talks about how Theodred died just like 5 days ago, or, you know, Theoden recently died. They recently had the Fords of Isen just, you know, run over by Saruman's Uruk-hai. And then he gets into a verbal altercation with Gandalf about what exactly Gandalf's role is, basically. He calls him, as he does in the movie, Lothspel, meaning ill news. And he says ill news is an ill guest, and he calls him Gandalf Stormcrow. And, you know, in the movie, Theoden gets the Stormcrow line. In the book, I think it's actually Grima, but it doesn't matter who says it so much. Grima, though, is the one who really gets into kind of needling Gandalf by saying, you know, you're always bringing bad news, and that's kind of a real problem because you're not helping us out any. You're just bringing bad news, and it seems to follow you. It doesn't seem to be like you're just bringing it. Gandalf says, well, you know, there's two kinds of people who bring bad news. There's that kind of person who actually, you know, the news follows, but there's also the kind of person who just warns you that something bad is about to happen and is willing to offer help. Wormtongue points out, like, you weren't here to help last time, you were seeking our help. And he also says there's a third kind of person who brings bad news, and he's the picker of bones, the person who comes along when everything's, you know, in ruins and, you know, takes what he can out of the situation, which is really interesting in the book, because what we will find out, as in the movie, that's basically who Wormtongue is. He's projecting a little bit here on Gandalf. And of course, he's projecting not in the psychological sense of he thinks Gandalf is what he is. He's trying to mislead Theoden because he doesn't want Theoden to think that that's who Wormtongue is, because that's who he is. He's going to be the picker of bones, as we will find out both in the movie and the book. He is waiting for everything to be over. And in fact, the movie, this already happened. Éomer has already pointed out to, you know, to Grima's face, like, I know what's going on here. You're in Saruman's pay, and this is, you know, what's going on. What was the promised price? That information comes up a little bit later in the book, and so it's not there now, but we will get it, and it will enlighten us a little bit either way. So in both cases, we know from broader context that Grima here is really projecting and saying that Gandalf is what, in fact, Wormtongue is. But it's in this context of saying, you know, that there's a third kind of bad news bringers, and that's the picker of bones, that he ends up basically insulting them all. And then Gandalf says, you know, like I said earlier, he's like, didn't your door wardens announce who these people are? Like, these are big names. They're not nobodies. And he then goes on to say, gray, they're in gray because the elves clad them in Lorien. And this brings up the next point, which is completely left out of the movie, but which is really interesting because we get another little subtle thing. Subtle in the sense that it's not a big action scene, but it's not subtle in the sense that it's hard to notice. What happens here is he mentions that they were clad in Lorien, and then Wormtongue takes the opportunity, which is not unintelligent on his part, to basically say, oh, you're in league with the sorceress of the Golden Wood. That's even worse. And this is not ill-timed on his part, because what happens is he's taking advantage of the fact that the Rohirrim are a little superstitious of elves, and in particular Lothlorien. You know, we already know from Éomer's earlier conversation with Aragorn as they were, talking about the Uruk-hai and all that, that they're not really like friendly with the Galadrim. They view them with a lot of suspicion, which is why Eomer and Gimli have this thing that will eventually be resolved about whether Galadriel is worth looking up to as opposed to being suspicious of. Gimli basically threatens to one-on-one kill Eomer if he doesn't shape up his opinion. So we know from this interaction, which happens in the book, it doesn't really happen so much in the movie, that the Rohirrim in general seem to have a very kind of superstitious doubt about the Golden Wood. They're not really a fan of it. They, have not high opinions of it, let's say. Wormtongue is clearly kind of trying to take advantage of that. He's using that as another little arrow in his quiver of, aha, another proof that you're just bad news, right? Gimli, of course, being the absolute Lancelot to Galadriel's Guinevere, in the book we get this little subtle thing, and like I said, it's not subtle in the sense that it's hard to notice because it's brought to our attention. When Grima gets done saying all this, Gimli kind of steps forward as if he's going to go bash his skull in right there, because he's, obviously peeved about, somebody trashing his Paragon lady. Gandalf puts his hand on his shoulder and then recites a little bit of a rhyme. And when he finishes the rhyme, you can look it up. I mean, it's easily available. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But when he finishes the rhyme, he then looks up at Grima again and says, "The wise speak only of what they know, but you have become a witless worm, therefore be silent." And this is where he says, as he also says in the movie, but in a different context, "Be silent and keep your forked tongue behind your teeth. I have not passed through fire and death to bandy crooked words with a serving man." The line's a little bit different in the movie and the book. Until the lightning falls. The line is a little bit longer in the book than in the movie. And in the movie, this is where he just kind of picks up his staff in a way that's kind of obvious to Grima, and like literally puts it in his face, because Wormtongue has come down and is basically talking face to face with Gandalf, and up to that point he's been holding it kind of almost parallel to the floor, such that you're looking along it if you're in Grima's position. Whereas it's not really clear what's going on in the book because we don't have a visual. But in the movie, what we get is he lifts the staff right in front of Wormtongue's face as if threatening him, which is not really what happens in the book at all. What happens in the book is that Gandalf raises his staff, which presumably means like lifts it kind of above his head, and then there's a bunch of darkness that comes out of nowhere, seemingly. The weather has basically brought a bunch of storm clouds over the Golden Hall, and everything goes dark. Not only that, the fire in the hall fades to embers, and it is at this point that Wormtongue is like, "Why didn't you take the wizard's staff? That fool Hama at the doors betrayed us." And, nothing has happened to threaten Wormtongue directly, but he clearly is thinking, oops, this guy has a magic wand and he's about to do magic things and I'm going to get hurt. That's clearly what's on Wormtongue's mind. And that's, not unreasonable, I guess, in his situation, but that's very much not what Gandalf is here to do in the book, whereas in the movie he very much is, because the next thing that happens, in the movie what we get is, "I told you to take the wizard's staff," and then, the thugs all come out and try to, beat up Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, and they trash him while Gandalf goes up to Theoden and magically exorcises him. Yeah, that's really the only thing I can say about that. But what we get is this action scene of... It's not even that much of an action scene, because the three hunters take out the thugs so easily that it's really more of just like a display of how awesome they are. And it's kind of in the background compared to what Gandalf is doing. And Gandalf immediately just goes for, "I know you're under a magic spell, so I'm just going to, release you from it magically. That's what I'm going to do." And then we get this thing where Theoden suddenly knows how to talk in a normal tone of voice and responds like, "You have no power here, Gandalf the Grey." And, you know, then we get the exorcism and we see that it's kind of Saruman controlling Theoden and all this stuff, right? But the whole thing is like interspersed with the barely fight that's going on in the background, which takes away from what's going on. Again, I'm not saying there's no drama in this scene, but the drama is kind of distracted because of the fight that's going on. And we even get like a whole, you know, corny line out of Gimli because he ends up throwing Wormtongue to the ground, which is completely unnecessary because Wormtongue ain't fighting. He's too wimpy for that. He throws Wormtongue to the ground and says, "I'd stay still if I were you." You know, which is just, you know, we didn't need that line interrupting what's going on with Gandalf. If we're going to do this thing, maybe we should focus on it for just a minute instead of having it, you know, go kind of back and forth. But anyway, Gandalf then goes and does the exorcism, and then Theoden just kind of magically recovers and de-ages in front of our eyes. In the book, what happens is very different. Because what happens is, after everything goes dark and Wormtongue makes his comment about, why didn't you take, you know, the wizard's staff, that's immediately followed by a flash of lightning or something, blinding everybody, and then Wormtongue just falls on his face because he's so presumably scared to death. And then Gandalf simply addresses Theoden. He just talks to him very calmly and says, you know, will you listen to me? It's not as dark as you think it is. You've been misled. Come and look out on your kingdom and see for yourself what things look like. And the implication here, which you have to kind of tease out yourself, is that Theoden has been just kind of sitting in this chair and listening, and this will kind of be made explicit later on in the book. He's just been getting his information through the poisoned lies of Wormtongue for so long that he hasn't really just directly gotten information on his own. And so what really is going on here is not that he's under a spell, it's just that he's, well, it's interesting that I say that. He is under a spell in the sense that the old English meaning of spell is just basically a spoken word. It doesn't mean necessarily magic. So Book Theoden is under a spell in that old sense because the spell he is under is the deceit of Wormtongue. But at any rate, what happens is Theoden, kind of shockingly and without any real resistance, just stands up very slowly. He's like leaning on a cane and starts to walk down and go with Gandalf to the doors. Eowyn kind of tries to stop or help him, and he basically says, no, you know, the time for fear is past. I'm just going to do this. And the interesting thing about this scene is as it goes on, we can see little clues that Theoden is recovering himself. It's not that he has, you know, been exorcised and therefore the thing that was magically making him age faster is gone and now he gets younger. He just starts acting younger. He first stands up real slow. He eventually loses the cane. He smiles at one point and it says the lines of his face, some of them go away and never come back. You know, he goes out and sits with Gandalf. I'm not necessarily doing all this in order, but these are like the ideas that we get in the book that kind of show the subtle change. What happens to Theoden is a lot different than what happens in the movie because basically he starts to act differently and therefore he becomes different. That's what goes on. Now, in terms of comparing the two scenes, this is almost where it stops because there isn't much more in the movie that matches up with the book, whereas the book, there's a lot more that goes on after this. Gandalf and Theoden will get into a kind of conference of just the two of them where Gandalf is whispering to him and we don't know what he says. The only thing we really get is that Theoden's eyes kind of brighten and widen as Gandalf is talking to him as if he's learning some really interesting stuff. And then Gandalf ends by saying out loud so that everybody can hear, yes, verily, that way our hope lies. And he's looking or pointing at Mount Doom, or Mordor generally. And so we know from the context that basically what he's been telling him is the whole ring plan, which not everybody needs to know. You know, this is strictly need to know information. And what he has done is given Theoden hope. He's basically said, yeah, everything looks terrible, but here's the plan, and here's why you should hope. And Theoden does take hope from this. And then he eventually, after this is over, he will basically tell Gandalf, I wish you had come earlier. The only real point of comparison between these two scenes after this is getting rid of Wormtongue. And that's done in such a short way in the movie. It's just kind of, you skip over all the interesting stuff. Gandalf will say in both the book and the movie, your hands would remember their old strength better if you held a sword. And the way this is done in the book and the movie is very different, because in the movie he basically just gets the sword from Hama immediately. That doesn't happen in the book. In the book, he kind of reaches for it and realizes it's not on his belt, and then he mutters under his breath, "Where's Grima stowed it?" And at the same time, roughly, Gandalf has basically answered a question by Theoden of, what should I do? And he says, there's a lot of things to do, but first send for Éomer, because don't I guess rightly that you have him in prison. Of course, in the movie, this is totally different, because Éomer is out, banished, and all this other stuff. He ends up being the force that saves, everybody at Helm's Deep, whereas in the book, that's Erkenbrand. And so, cinematically, you can understand why they didn't want to introduce Erkenbrand for all of a scene. And, whatever. So it's understandable why they did it that way. But here, the drama is very different, because he's imprisoned his own nephew. He's literally put his own nephew in jail for chasing after orcs. Which, by the way, Gandalf will also talk about and say, if he hadn't broken the rules, we might actually be in a much worse position right now, because Merry and Pippin would be in the hands of Saruman, and that could be a real problem. And partially that connects to the ring plan, and partially it just connects to the fact that now he's got hostages, and there's a bunch of different stuff. But anyway, point being, here Éomer is in jail, and Hama, who went to let him out, also gave Éomer his sword, which he really technically wasn't supposed to do. Hama just assumed Éomer was supposed to be freed and therefore gave him his sword. But anyway, as Theoden is looking for his sword, Éomer comes up and says, here, take mine. It was ever at your service. And Theoden kind of looks at Hama like, what's going on here? You weren't supposed to give him that? He doesn't say that out loud, but that is the implication, and Hama admits, maybe I assumed too much. But Éomer basically, says, I'm just giving it back to you anyway. And so Theoden takes Éomer's sword, and he grips it, and again we get a subtle cue that he's acting younger here and becoming the man that he once was. So and I should also note here, as far as the whole getting younger thing, at the very beginning, it was noted by the narrator, but basically it had to be somebody in the group that noticed this, that he seemed very stooped and kind of small, but you could tell that when he stood up straight, he would have to be tall. And it notes also when he stands up, he, is indeed tall, and then he straightens himself out, and he's, really tall. So we get an image of him early on of this guy who looks old and is just, curled over with age and not, able to do much of anything. And by the time we get here, he has lost his cane, he has stood up straight, and he has gripped something, and his face looks younger. So, all of this is happening without magical intervention on Gandalf's part. This is just Theoden being given hope and becoming a different person as a result. So it's a very subtle but very significant thing. Now, the only other point here about how he gets rid of Wormtongue is, in the movie, he looks at his sword, and then he looks at Wormtongue like, you're in trouble. And then, we see him getting thrown down the stairs, and he almost kills him, and Aragorn stops him. This is very different in the book. What happens is Theoden makes the decision, we're going to ride, and we're going to, meet Saruman's forces, and we're going to, try to stop this disaster before it becomes a real disaster. And Wormtongue kind of throws his last attempt at, making something happen in his favor. Theoden actually tells Wormtongue, get your sword, we're going to war. And Wormtongue's like, no, don't send me from your side. And Theoden's like, no, I'm going too. And, he tries to play it off and be like, oh, you're such a great hero, but, maybe you should leave somebody behind to watch the hall. And Éomer's like, yeah, no. And Gandalf's like, you don't understand. He's playing a dangerous game here. Theoden, he's dead set on this or whatever. But Gandalf basically ends up saying, here's what you do. You offer him the choice. You can either go to war or you can go to Saruman. And Theoden basically says, okay, Grima, take a horse. What you gonna do? Are you gonna come with us or are you gonna ride? And Wormtongue now knows that he's trapped, and he's looking at everybody like, ugh, and he's just, you could tell the way the writing is done and the way it's described that he is absolutely just beaten, and he's caught. He knows that he's stuck, and he doesn't know how to get out of it at this point. And of course, he takes the option of going to Saruman, and Theoden lets him go. And basically, the whole point of this was, this is the final test to see if he really is loyal to you or if he's as deceitful as it seems he is. And of course, he proves that he was a scumbag. But it's so well done, and the way that Gandalf plays the whole thing is like, yeah, yep, that was a good way to trap him. And that's really kind of the end of the sequence as far as comparing the two. Now, as far as the drama and how Jackson kind of kills all this with the action, there's a lot of action in the Peter Jackson movie where there is none in the book, unless you count Gandalf kind of making lightning flash as action. That's really kind of it. There's even action in the movie in terms of how Theoden gets rid of Grima, because he throws him downstairs and he's about to kill him before Aragorn stops him, which to me is a really terrible way to handle that whole scene. Because Aragorn just stops him and says, no, let him go, enough blood has been spilled on his account. Like, if anything, that's a reason to just put him to death, because he deserves it. But at any rate, that whole thing is, just an expression of Theoden's rage more than anything else. Whereas in the book, everything is much more subtle. Theoden, when he's dealing with Wormtongue, knows what he's dealing with at this point, and he basically won't give in to the slimy, tricks that Grima tries to play at this point. And Grima is really on the back foot and kind of like, okay, what can I come up with now? And just keeps trying things. And it really shows Grima's character a lot more. Yes, in the movie, he's kind of clearly a coward and a weakling, but, it doesn't really show us much of anything about his intelligence. Whereas in the book, we do get the sense that he's a smart guy. And Gandalf even says at one point, you were counted wise, and at one time you were a help, to Theoden. But it's in the context of some of that later conversation that Gandalf brings up, how long have you been working for Saruman? And then he mentions, too, like, you have your pick of the treasure, or even a woman. And Éomer was like, yeah, I've known that for a while. But he never said anything before, because it was kind of like, there's really no way to prove it. But the scene in the Peter Jackson thing is, it's so much shorter, and there's so much action kind of being interspersed with it, and everything done is like an action, and action, and action. Exorcising Theoden is an action. Fighting off the thugs is an action. Throwing Grima down the steps is an action. In the book, everything is talk, except for Gandalf, apparently using a little bit of magic to affect the weather and the level of the fire so as to, change the lighting situation. Other than that, everything is just him talking. And in fact, in the book, in one sense, it's really shocking and not built up how Theoden is suddenly just like, okay, I'm going to listen to Gandalf now. Now, in a sense, it's not, because Gandalf has just done some stuff, right? He has apparently made everything go dark, and then a lightning flash, which would imply that he has a lot of power. And so it's understandable how maybe Theoden would be like, maybe you aren't here just bringing bad news. Maybe you actually can help me out of the situation. But most of what's going on is really Theoden just kind of listening to Gandalf's words and weighing them against Wormtongue's words and realizing on his own, yeah, I really should kind of step up and be the king that I'm supposed to be, and not just rely on this slimy guy who's just telling me stuff all the time. And so that starts the process, and it goes from there. And the real beauty of how he goes from this bent over decrepit old man to still old, but now much more strong and hale and independent, is a really interesting, subtle change compared to this, oh, I've hit you in the head with the staff and exorcised Saruman, and therefore now you just go from looking like you're about to croak to, looking like you're in your 60s. And a fairly good looking 60s at that. So I mean, the way that the book handles this, and again, as I've said in other book versus movie comparisons before, some of this is kind of inevitable. You cannot draw out this scene as much in the movie as it is in the book without taking up an enormous amount of time, which is just not really feasible in a movie where you already have to pack in so much stuff. But even apart from that, you still have the problem of, why do we have to have all the violence in the background that kind of takes the focus away from all these other things? It was in a video not too long ago, I think, that I did about, I don't remember exactly, but I talked about how in the Weathertop scene, Aragorn fighting the ring wraiths on Weathertop in the movie is a very different kind of scene than the book version, where on Weathertop there's really no action at all except for at the last minute when the Witch King kind of runs forward and stabs Frodo as Frodo is trying to stab him, and everything else is just kind of like slow and steady build up of fear and what's going on. And same thing here. You start introducing all these action elements where they're not really needed, and it kind of just takes away from what's going on that's really important in the scene. Take out all the thugs. Is the scene really worse? Right? Was there any point? What's the reason behind that other than to display, the absolute prowess of Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, who are apparently so much better at fighting than literally everybody else in Middle-earth that they can just trash a group of guys twice their number. It's just, we've already gotten that. They've already fought the Uruk-hai on Amon Hen. We know they can take out a lot of baddies, right? We don't need it to happen over and over and over again. We don't need them to beat up a bunch of thugs in this scene. It's just unnecessary. And again, it's not that that is necessarily a horrible decision in and of itself, but imagine if instead of wasting some of the time on that, Peter Jackson had done something a little more subtle like the book had done. It's a very different feel. You don't get the same sense of, there's this problem that has to be magicked away and we just have to protect Gandalf while he's doing the magicking. I have to say, it's understandable why you wouldn't do it exactly like it was done in the book, because it really is, until you read it a few times and really think about it, the book version does seem just a little bit forced and ad hoc in a way. It's like, why is Theoden suddenly just okay with going with Gandalf? Theoden led off in the scene in the book saying, you're bad news and you're not welcome here, really. I don't really care for you to be here at all. So Theoden is kind of actively being the antagonist in some sense. And he just turns around after Gandalf has some conversation with Grima, which doesn't really seem to specifically address a whole lot of any of Theoden's concerns. So it's like, why is this a thing that happens in the book? Well, the answer to that question, I think, is not just the fact that Gandalf is apparently doing some magic in this scene. The other thing that we know about Gandalf when we read the appendices and some of the other stuff is that he is carrying the Ring of Fire. And the Ring of Fire, and Gandalf in general, if we read some of the stuff about him in the Silmarillion and whatnot as a Loren, both of them are particularly good at inspiring others, at, awakening feelings and thoughts and things like that in other people. Gandalf's real magic in this scene is not necessarily playing with the weather and whatnot. It's really more about reaching Theoden's heart and mind and getting him to realize what's going on, to inspire him to the courage that he needs to be the king he needs to be. That's what's really going on here. But it's not obvious in the text the first time you read it. But when you read the book a few times and you've read the appendices and you see the kind of things that happen when Gandalf is around, example, think of Minas Tirith and the siege there, wherever Gandalf and Imrahil go on the walls, everybody's kind of, enheartened and emboldened, but wherever they leave, they all get afraid and kind of cower down from the Nazgul again. This is what Gandalf does to people. That's literally like his thing. So when you come back to the scene with that knowledge, then you can understand it better. And this is why, again, you can see why in the movie they wouldn't do this, because it's a lot harder to understand. It's like, if you just saw that scene in the movie, you'd be like, why did that happen? That doesn't seem to follow at all. It's only in a book where you can go and really drag out all this stuff and have all these things happen and show many instances of it, and then in the appendices explain what's going on, that you can really get that full sense of, now I know why, this scene makes sense. In the movie, it would be so hard to do that without being absurdly clunky. So again, the main point here is, it's a very different kind of scene. And you can understand why the movie does it very differently. I think it's still kind of a waste to have the thugs there in the movie. I don't think that was necessary at all. I also think you could have done a better job in the movie of making the transformation a little more subtle and a little less just magic Saruman out of Theoden. But it is understandable. You could see why Peter Jackson went the route that he did. Again, very different medium, very different method of storytelling. You just don't have the opportunity to do the things in the movie that you do in the book, and so it's hard to make some of those things work. But in the book, it's not a well-told scene in the sense that the scene taken by itself makes a whole lot of sense. It's only in the broader context of knowledge that you get when you know everything that you're like, oh, I see what happened there, and that's really cool. You can pick up hints of it even in this scene a little bit, but it's really subtle, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense until you know other things that we haven't gotten to yet, which is interesting. It's a decision on Tolkien's part that is fascinating, but it's the kind of decision Tolkien makes all the time. Gandalf will say things like, Olorin I was in the West, that is forgotten. He doesn't say that on screen, as it were. That's Faramir reporting Gandalf to Frodo and Sam. And we get literally no explanation of that. Like, what does that mean? We don't know what the West that is forgotten is. We don't know why he was called Olorin. If you read the Silmarillion, then you understand that. But this is a thing that Tolkien does all the time. He will do things, and this is where a lot of people mess up and think of things as plot holes. Not necessarily this specific instance, but things like this, where something will happen in a story that is not explicitly explained by what happens in the scene or by prior events, and it's like, well, that doesn't make sense, that's a plot hole. No, that's not a plot hole. A plot hole is when you can't explain it. If you can explain it with the right assumptions, it's not a plot hole. It might be bad storytelling, depending on the situation. In Tolkien's case, it's not bad storytelling, because what he is doing, he is slowly, over the course of the story, revealing Gandalf to us. In the beginning of the story of The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf is just kind of the same Gandalf he was in The Hobbit. As things go on, we learn little by little more about him. We will get a scene with him and Pippin riding on Shadowfax where Pippin suddenly is like, how old is Gandalf? Where'd he come from? Where's he gonna go? Like, what? Who is this guy? And by that point in the book, if we've been paying attention, we're probably thinking the same exact thing. And we will learn just enough in The Lord of the Rings to get a little bit more of an answer to that. But that's why it's an interesting storytelling choice on Tolkien's part, because in the book you can do that. In the movie you can't really do that. But Tolkien can do that in the book because he gives us, these little nuggets here and there that kind of build up who Gandalf is in our mind, but still leaves a little bit of mystery. Just like he'll tell us about the story of Beren and Luthien, and tell us about the Silmaril without explaining at all what a Silmaril is. And it's like, okay, so that's just another one of those things that Tolkien gives us that open up new mysteries to explore later on down the road. Now, a lot of the mysteries get answered once you get to the Silmarillion, and that's awesome. But that's how the storytelling works radically differently in these two scenes, because one of them is not about just making everything obvious to you. The movie kind of has to do that a little bit. It doesn't have the luxury that the book has. So that's really, at the end of the day, I think the difference between these two, at least the primary difference that drives most of the rest of the differences. The book just has the ability to do this sort of slow build-up expansion and exploration of Gandalf's character, and this is part of that. The movie doesn't really have the opportunity to do that in the same way, and so it has to come up with a different way of doing this scene. So that is my exploration of how the drama in these scenes is really different, but how it points us to something much deeper about how the storytelling thing goes in these two. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please give it a like or a thumbs up or whatever to help spread it around. Share it with others who might be interested. If you're interested in catching more of my content, make sure you're subscribed. If you're on YouTube, click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions, and check the description below for other support and social links. And until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially Paul Leone, Nathan Dufour, and Robert Kindling.